So, hi everyone, welcome back to the History Buff. And today I am joined by a familiar face, a fellow tour guide, Miss Ernestina, as I call her, but real name Tina of Tina's Tours Berlin. Hello, welcome back.
Hi, Artie. Super nice to be back on the History Buff.
Lovely to have you. Yeah, your rightful place as a recurring history buff now. Very excited to have you here because we're going to be talking about a topic which is a big feature of what we talk about on our tours. And I guess you could say it's something that has become somewhat of a legend here in Germany, hasn't it? You know, because life in Berlin after the war was during and immediately after the war was extremely tough. And for no one more so than the women. And the images of these women is something that I think is very ingrained in the collective memory. And those women that we're talking about are known as the Rubble Women. This comes from the English translation of the German word Trümmerfrauen, which obviously is a very German way of naming these women because it's just very kind of
literal. The Germans love a literal naming of things there. So what shall we call the women who cleared the rubble?
The Rubble Women.
Yeah. What else? Yeah.
So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, I mean, I guess let's just start by introducing them. Rubble Women was the name given to these women who cleared, cleaned and sorted the rubble from the war destruction of German cities to prepare for reconstruction. I guess that's the most basic way you could
absolutely
it. As I said, they became a positive symbol of Germany at the time when it was totally physically and crucially morally destroyed.
I think today one of the most prevailing and prevalent images in the German narrative is women clearing the rubble in the wake of the Second World War. It allows Germany to have a kind of this positive image of itself after one of its absolute darkest period of history. It's kind of become synonymous with the rebuilding and the creation of a new Germany.
Yeah.
So Rubble Woman is most definitely one of the most famous and iconic images that you've got in the nation
100%,
today.
100%. Now, there's two kind of key elements to their story, which we'll talk about. First of all, there's the human element. Obviously, the experiences of the Trümmerfrauen, of the Rubble Women, you know, their motivations for clearing the rubble, you know, whether it was driven by necessity, if they were forced to do so, or, you know, if they did it to just, you know, survive, the methods and, you know, the feelings. And then the other element is the symbolic element. So, you know, how the image of the Rubble Woman has been used in German history and how it has shaped into somewhat of a myth for political purposes. And that's something that we'll also talk about, is that a lot of historians do agree today that the contribution of the Rubble Women has been largely inflated.
Yeah. I think with a lot of topics in history, there's the what actually happened and then the how's it been used.
Exactly.
And how has that changed the popular perception of what actually happened. So we're going to be talking about, this kind of individual, this human element. What did women actually contribute? What did that look like for them as individuals? Without trying to minimize that for a second.
Of course.
On the individual human scale, some of the things that these women did are really incredible, significant. And then there's how that was kind of harnessed or appropriated or inflated and used differently by the two Germanys, which is always so interesting in German history. You've got what did the East do with it, what did the West do with it, and what's happened with it today.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Speaking of the two Germanys, that's a perfect cue for us to dive right in and start, obviously, with the background history of the Rubble Women, which obviously begins at the end of the Second World War. So, I mean, it is important to remember that the clearing of rubble had been going on throughout the whole of the bombing campaigns of German cities. It's just that in those times it wasn't done by German civilians. It was done by prisoners of war. It was done by forced laborers. The utilization of women for clearing rubble largely came at the end of the war, when Germany lay in ruins. So massive destruction from Allied bombings all over the country. I'm sure, you know, most of you know some of the details about this, but about a quarter of the 16 million homes in Germany were completely destroyed in bombing campaigns, and another quarter were severely damaged. About 40% of the transport facilities and half of all school buildings were unusable. And yeah, in total, more than 400 million cubic meters of rubble lay throughout Germany at the end of the war.
I found a great statistic that put that in perspective. It said that if you would have piled up all of the rubble, there's 400 cubic meters of rubble that lay strewn across Germany at the end of the Second World War, it would have created a 4,000 meter high mountain, which would be like the size of an alpine mountain.
Wow.
If you'd piled up Germany's rubble, you'd create an alpine mountain.
Wow, that is mental.
Yeah.
Yeah, and things like that does actually really put it into perspective. And yeah, and it's important, but it is important to stress that also we're talking with these stats, we're talking about the whole of Germany, so not just Berlin. You've got to remember that pretty much every single German urban center lay in ruins at the end of the war. So it was a pretty nightmarish time. You had also had, through Allied bombing campaigns, the deaths of 650,000 German civilians, mostly obviously women and children. And yeah, it was a pretty traumatic time for more reason than one.
Also, I read some interesting articles that talked about the fact that other cities that were bombed, like, for example, British cities, they could also, psychologically, the population could also turn on anger, which can actually be quite a useful coping mechanism. I studied psychology. We used to say anger is the bodyguard of sadness. Because, of course, they were the wronged nations. They could also grab onto this anger. Whereas, of course, the Germans were the guilty.
Yes.
And so, not trying to, apologize for German crimes or anything, but that's also an additional psychological element. They're living in rubble. There's practically no infrastructure, and they're the guilty. Yeah, they, what did they allow in the period of the Nazi regime?
They weren't going to get any sympathy from the world, basically. They knew that. Yeah, it was a very different situation for them because they knew that they wouldn't get any sympathy. So obviously there was an immediate need to clear the rubble to start reconstruction. Now, there was obviously a severe labor shortage because you had, millions of men that were either dead.
One in five German men at the end of the Second World War was dead.
Yeah.
And then, of course, so many of the other men were in prisoner of war camps. By the end of exactly. A lot of the men who were actually in a city like Berlin at the end, they were very young, or they were elderly, or they were there because they had been really severely injured in warfare. So I found one statistic that actually said in October 1946, there were 7 million more women than men in Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. 7 million more available women by the 1945 population estimates. So, yeah, basically women had to essentially step up. So obviously then, taking on the very physically demanding task of rubble clearance.
Berlin, like much of Germany, lies in rubble. The Germans trying to survive in that rubble are the guilty nation who are effectively responsible for their own devastation. Most of the men are missing. 2/3 of Berlin's 2.3 million population are female, and over 1 million of them are homeless because of the devastation. And compounded on top of all of that, there's the trauma and the functional after effects of the rape of Berlin. So, trigger warning, we're not about to go into detail on this. It would be a podcast entirely in its own right. But I just can't live with myself whenever I don't address this, whenever we talk about the context of the end of the Second World War. And this piece of history is often not talked about, often even actively suppressed. It's dismissed to this day in much of Russia as myth. There was a some almost describe it as weaponized campaign of rape against women in not only Berlin, but many areas of Soviet-occupied Europe in the wake of the Second World War. People often dismiss this by saying, oh, well, on the list of Nazi atrocities were also sexual violence and rape. And I personally say I don't think that really makes it okay.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't justify it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to liberate, the element of sexual violence and war. It's often an unspoken about element of warfare. The female experience is often also unaddressed. That's what we're doing in this podcast. So we have to, of course, address the fact that these rubble women who find themselves effectively largely a major force now responsible for sorting out the cities, they are also dealing with the psychological trauma, sometimes the disease, sometimes the pregnancy, sometimes the need to seek an abortion of the campaign of mass rape. Right, in the immediately post-war period, mostly in the Soviet area or zone, although not to say that there weren't raped
Yeah,
from
it
other
did
allied
happen in the
armies.
Western sectors, but nowhere near as
Not
much.
to the scale, yeah. 2 million abortions a year were carried out in the immediately post-war period, mostly in the Soviet
And
war.
remember, obviously, abortion was, of course,
Normally.
illegal back then. So these abortions would have been dirty backstreet abortions.
And 150 to 200,000, as they called them, Russian babies were born as a result of rape, or so it's estimated. I mean, to get accurate statistics on a mass campaign of rape at the end of a war, I don't think will ever exist.
And you've also got to remember all that horrible, the after effects because of the shame that these women would have felt. You would have had, suicides. You would have had, these dirty backstreet abortions, all of this kind of stuff. So you've got to remember, so for the German women, and in total, an estimated 2 million German women throughout the whole country were raped by Soviet soldiers. So largely by Soviet soldiers. So it was a very, very, very tough, traumatic time for German women at the end of the war. And I think the Rubble Women go some way to showing the resolve of the German spirit, the unbreakable resolve, I suppose you could say. It really sort of fits into that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly at least how it's been harnessed, and I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll start with the nature of their work. I guess you guys, it's, pretty self-explanatory, but, clearing rubble involved heavy back-breaking labor. So, lifting stones, removing debris, and also crucially sorting unusable materials. Because obviously in the rebuilding of Berlin, they wanted to save as much money as possible in rebuilding the city. So they needed to make sure that they saved all of the salvageable materials.
Yeah.
So these women worked with basic tools or bare hands. Now, the average workday of a Trümmerfrau was 9 hours long with a 20 to 30-minute lunch break.
So one of the big motivators for women, there's been this historical image that they worked voluntarily, they're just doing what has to be done. Some women, absolutely. They are just clearing way from their area of the city to the nearest water pump. They are clearing out rubble from their own home, and they are sorting out the bricks and the pipes that could be used to rebuild it. But for the most part, women were gathered together and put to work, particularly in the Soviet sector, not so much in the other sectors. And at a certain point, they could volunteer, but they're still paid, right? They're getting this 70 Pfennig salary, which was very small. But one of the major perks of being an actual organized Rubble Woman was that you go into the second highest ration category in post-war Berlin. And that was literally a lifesaver. So a housewife's ration category, meaning you're not an active person, you're not actively laboring, it was somewhere between 900 and 1,200 calories per day. Right, so this is grossly inadequate for a human being to sustain themselves.
Yeah, for women, it's actually it's meant to be 2,000 a day, I think it is.
Something like that, yeah. Like that. And meanwhile, if you became a Trümmerfrau, you're looking more like 2,000 to 2,400 calories a day, which is a massive difference.
Yeah.
That literally was how many women, by becoming Rubble Women, they actually helped sustain their entire family circle.
Right. Okay. Becoming Trümmerfrauen, it really, was the difference between eating properly or just getting by, I suppose. Something that I found was that many did actually become Rubble Women voluntarily, but actually also women did actually become, especially if they lived in the Soviet sector, they would actually often be forced to become Rubble Women. So yeah, obviously a considerable number of these women were from the Soviet zone, but men and machinery also played a significant role in the clearing efforts across the whole nation. So, it's just obviously we are focusing on the Rubble Women and their legacy. Okay, so that's why, we're doing this episode now. They were actually listed as builders, rubble workers, or workers for clearance. The way that they actually did the brick salvaging process is quite interesting. So they demolished sections of the walls to separate undamaged bricks. They passed the bricks hand to hand in a chain to the roadside. Now, these are the famous images that I think quite a lot of people would have seen. They placed these bricks on wooden trestles or solid surfaces, removed mortar residue with bricklayers or plastering hammers, and stacked the bricks as per specific guidelines. So usually 16 pieces per area, so 4 by 4, 12 layers on top of each other and a central pile of 8 pieces, creating sacks of 200 bricks. So then that meant that these bricks were then ready to just be picked up and taken off for rebuilding. Yeah, they reused half bricks, beams, steel girders, stoves, wash basins, toilet bowls, pipes, and other items. So when they had these piles of rubble, the stuff that wasn't able to be reused, these were obviously then put in skips or in
wagons, I think. Yeah, they erected wagons on rails on the streets. Yeah.
And they actually constructed specific railways to be able to take it from the city and they were called rubble railways. And they would then take these piles of rubble out to the suburbs. And in Berlin, there is a very famous hill of rubble called Teufelsberg, or Devil's Mountain. And it's famous because on top of it, you have an abandoned listening station, an abandoned US listening station from the Cold War. It's really cool. It's now an artist colony. Yeah, and the hill that it's on top of is one of those rubble mountains. And
I think we've got over a dozen of those in Berlin.
Yeah, no, we do. I actually didn't know that, but this is obviously, Teufelsberg is obviously the most famous. But yeah, they have multiple ones, all around kind of in the sort of suburb areas.
Yeah, and often so the usable rubble, right, they're piling it into these wagons. It's being pulled either by humans or by horses out to places where it can be useful. Or sometimes Germans are actually taking the useful bits for their own homes. I found a story about a young woman who, in 1947, her mother finally found a builder who said, I can rebuild your house, but you need to bring 700 of your own bricks. And they were on the 3rd floor, so they needed the kind of bricks with a hollow, they were hollow in the middle. Of course, the kind of bricks that shattered the most easily during the bombing and the battle.
Yeah.
And so this girl and her sisters, they spent weeks going through the piles of rubble, usable and unusable piles, until they found the 700 bricks with which their home could be rebuilt. So usable bits, were allocated to rebuilding. But what was considered non-usable or didn't really know what to do with it was often piled up in these, what now has become the hills of Berlin. And often they dumped this kind of considered unusable rubble at sites that had been built by the Nazis and would just be too big to get rid of.
Yes.
Famously, 2 out of the 3 sets of flak towers. So flak anti-aircraft fire, and the Nazis built 3 of those twin flak towers in Berlin. The British managed to get rid of those, which was just a massive undertaking of theirs in their sector. But the others, the flak towers in Friedrichshain in the Soviet sector and in Homboldhain, they were just too big to get rid of, right? These flak towers were designed for 15,000 people to take refuge inside. We're talking meters and meters of concrete on ceilings, on walls, built to design the dropping of bombs. Yeah. And so instead of destroying these monstrous chunk of concrete at the end of the war, often they would just pile unusable rubble from the chaos of the city into these.
Yeah.
And so things like, in Volkspark Friedrichshain or the People's Park of Friedrichshain, there's a hill. It's actually piled up rubble on top of what used to be a flak tower, and grass has just grown over it. And now it's one of the only hills in Berlin.
Yeah. No, and I believe Teufelsberg is built on top of a technical college. Yeah, which was basically indestructible. They couldn't destroy it. And so, they were like, if we can't destroy it, let's just dump all the rubble on it. Yeah, exactly. I love that.
And that's how Berlin got hills. Other than that, it's a very flat city.
Exactly.
Great for bike riding.
That is actually so true. I didn't think about it like that. Yeah, so if you see any hills in Berlin, chances are it's probably made out of rubble.
Yeah, literally.
So, that was the story of what happened to the unusable rubble, and so the story of the rubble.
What a Rubble Woman's day looked like was very different based on when she's being allocated to work, at what time. For example, normally there's this process we're talking about whereby they're clearing out the rubble from bomb damage, they're sorting it, they're cleaning the bricks, they're stacking them, they're sending them off. But sometimes that looked different. Like, for example, right in the wake of the Second World War, I found accounts from many women who were, for example, involved in sorting live ammunition. Right? Berlin's Tiergarten Park, for example, if you've visited Berlin, the big, beautiful park right behind the Brandenburg Gate on the edge of Parliament, that was full of basically stuff that soldiers had dumped at the end of the war in the hope that they wouldn't be recognized by the Red Army as soldiers. And so I found an account about a woman who, when she was 18 years old, was told, okay, everyone between the age of 15 and 50 has to present for work. She presented for work, and a Soviet female officer said, you're allocated to the Tiergarten Park. And when she arrived, she said she worked with about 40 women that day. or that period, sorry. And they had to go through this piles of stuff in the Tiergarten Park. Any live ammunition they were told to throw in a little lake there. Yeah, and a couple of women unfortunately did actually die when something they were throwing in the lake exploded on them. And anything that wasn't dangerous, they were told to pile up in a bomb crater, and they were told that later some other band of women would come and sort through it and figure out what in that crater was usable.
Wow.
And so that's kind of one of the stories of the Rubble Women, which is very different to that image of kind of almost chain gangs of women passing stones, cleaning stones, that becomes more famous just that little bit later in the post-war story.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. I didn't know that. Also, another interesting story about it is that actually the Rubble Women actually influenced fashion in Berlin. So after the war, Berlin very quickly became the fashion capital of Germany. Women sold personal belongings for food during the war, exchanging items like stockings and carpets for essentials like potatoes, which obviously towards the end of the war became increasingly hard to get. With the arrival of the Allied soldiers and rubble clearing, women found obviously then more objects to sell because they were going through these, destroyed buildings, clearing the rubble. So, when they cleared a certain amount of rubble, they'd obviously find some objects in the house. So they would sell these objects, but also they found rags that were salvaged from the debris. Old shop owners used sewing machines to turn these rags into dresses called Lumpenkleider or rag dresses. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just a testament to the resourcefulness of the human spirit. And so, and it really gives this kind of sense of normalcy and hope that they were trying to get back to kind of pre-war life as soon as possible.
So I actually found what looks like quite a beautiful book, unfortunately, as far as I could see, only published in German, called Darf man jetzt von Mode sprechen, or Are we allowed to talk about fashion yet? Which is about fashion and the textile industry and also this resourcefulness in post-war Germany. And in there was this amazing story about a little girl in post-war Germany where her mum manages to sew for her from whatever fabric they could find one good dress. So that in the following years, if ever anything important was happening at school, she had one good dress. And she called it her Little Red Riding Hood dress because the colors were red, black, and white. Where do we think mum got fabric of red, black, and white in the wake of the Second World War? It was an old Nazi flag. She found an old Nazi flag in the roof. She wasn't allowed to have it.
Wow.
So turned it into a dress for her daughter.
Kind of still quite resourceful, though.
Very resourceful. I mean, the best use of a Nazi flag ever existed. Frank, there's nothing else good to do with one. Yeah, and I think if we're talking fashion, I had the most incredible stories about women taking on old soldiers' uniforms and altering them into overalls so they had appropriate clothing to wear while laboring. If we're talking fashion in post-war Berlin, we also have to address fraternization.
Because obviously a lot of the time women would want to look nice for the Allied soldiers because obviously, getting intimate with the occupying soldiers was a way for protection, food, just security basically. So
yeah, although a lot of Germans really looked down on women for this, I found the most fascinating article that actually said that for many Germans, that fraternization, what was seen as promiscuity, was actually seen as a break of morality that started after the Nazi time. Not in the Nazi time, after.
After, yeah.
And for many Germans trying to romanticize the good old days, that fraternization was actually seen as a loss of morality starting at the end of the Nazi period, which is a very scary article. So for many Germans, they looked down terribly on those women who fraternized with the occupation soldiers. But for other women, it was an element of survival.
Yes, exactly.
The food, because the mark became so useless, right, in the chaos of the post-war period, of course, mark that had the swastika on it couldn't keep circulating, so the Allied armies quickly issued occupation marks, which also quickly were just totally valueless. There's this thriving black market economy. American cigarettes could often buy you more food to put on your family table than the actual currency could, and that was only really relieved with the currency reform of 1948 when actual kind of stable mark was introduced. And so for a lot of women, it was For some, it was probably a choice of actual pleasure or desire, but for many women, it was just a smart survival choice.
Yes.
If you
exactly.
fraternize with an occupation soldier, you get access to their rations and their cigarettes, which you can trade.
Yes.
And so looking nice for some women was not just about this curious desire that we seem to have inside of us, even in chaos, to want to look nice. It was for many women also a survival task.
Definitely. And that is something that, because also a lot of these women would have been left without husbands, with young children to care for, so that, they had also dependents to also think about as well. So that's something that people have to remember.
Oh yeah, talking about the nature of their work, that's something I'd also like to address is, today, although we paint these women in German history painted as heroes who selflessly totally cleaned the streets of Germany. And it's like, well, a lot of them were doing it because they kind of had to, or they got rations, or they got paid, or it was necessity. It's like, if I don't clear the way to water, I can't get water. And many of the women whose interviews I found, they said, like, this idea of us as heroes only developed much later. We were just doing what we had to do. But that being said, often when I read the accounts of what these women were achieving, by my today, like, naive, very privileged standards, I feel like, man, I'd call that pretty heroic.
Yeah.
They're working as a rubble woman effectively all day. That's, they talked about their hands being stripped back because they're working with inadequate tools, if any at all. And then in addition to that, they're having to stand in line to actually trade these ration coupons into rations. Sometimes that's hours and hours of queuing a day because there was so little available. There was so much black market economy that often what you were meant to get with your ration coupon cards, you couldn't. So then they're also often standing or walking hours a day to go to the black market to trade for the things that they couldn't get with their ration cards to feed their families. And then they also talked about the hours and hours of constantly searching for anything you could burn as firewood. One account of a woman I found who cleared out ammunition in Tiergarten Park, she said they realized that the hand grenades had wooden handles. And if you broke off the wooden handle of a hair grenade, you could cook at home. You could cook, right? You could use that to light your stove. So they're working as rubble women. They're queuing for rations. They're queuing for the black market. They're gathering wood so they can attempt to cook at home with whatever totally menial access to food they have. And they're doing all of that normal caring for children that comes with being a mother.
Yeah.
That is genuinely incredible.
Yeah. It does sound like, going above and beyond by any stretch of the imagination.
Or certainly for someone me who, cross fingers touch wood, I've been privileged enough never to have to live in this kind of profound survival environment. That is, for me, that's a massive amount of work.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and even if we've kind of over history inflated how much of German cities were cleared by these women, one account estimate I read said that you'd need 42,000 women working for 25 years to have cleared all the rubble of Germany. The reality is that although the image was they worked alone, they didn't. They had machinery. They sometimes had companies. They sometimes had men. And they were mostly only in the Soviet zone. Regardless, if you look at an individual woman and what she was doing just for the survival of herself and her family at that time,
and all
the
extra trauma that women had to suffer, so because I think they did suffer, other traumas, like the mass rape and then having to look out for their families and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, no, I definitely think that you're right. Like they were definitely very resilient. And as I mentioned earlier, these rubble women, for me, they represent the resilience of the human spirit and the unbreakable resolve of the human spirit. Just a bit of background. So if you don't know about it, go and watch or listen to the series about the Berlin Wall, because you might be able to find out about this in more detail. But after the war, Germany was divided, which would eventually become West Germany or capitalist democratic Germany, and East Germany or socialist Germany. West Germany being the Federal Republic of Germany, East Germany being the German Democratic Republic. But first of all, West Germany was the British, American and French sectors in the West, and the GDR, East Germany, was the Soviet sector. Now, Berlin itself was also divided into 4 sectors between these 4 victorious powers. So Soviet Union, United States, Britain and France. The way you've got to think about this is what these 2 ideologies and systems wanted to get out of
this image.
Image. Because, and it was both sides. It wasn't just one side. But I will say that from the research that I've done in the East, so in the Soviet sector, which would become the GDR, they were more, I think, celebrated.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that fit with the ideology. East Germany was claiming that they were on the route to realizing Marx's communism, a society where we're all equal, and equality in the Marxist ideology should lead not only to equality around, wealth and access to resources and no class divide, it should also lead to equality between the genders. And so East Germany's story was that they'd created a thriving socialist state. And so, of course, for that to be true, there had to be gender equality.
Yes.
So East Germany was super proud of the fact that women worked. It also had comparatively really liberal, progressive, as I would call them today, conditions around, not originally, it came later, but divorce, abortion, childcare. And the truth was that there was not gender equality. There was a serious glass ceiling for women. Women didn't make it into the center of the government, but women worked. And I recently finished a fascinating book, can recommend Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism. In many ways, East Germany was much further on the road of women's liberation than West Germany. Absolutely.
Definitely. I mean, the West was very conservative.
Oof.
The church actually had a lot of influence in the state, in the West. And, well, it had a lot of influence over the Conservative Party, which dominated post-war politics in West Germany. They were celebrated because, as I said, they were embodying the values of, hard work, collective effort. And it's quite funny. The difference is illustrated in this story of a visit to Berlin, to East Berlin, by an SPD politician from the western state of Bavaria. So someone called Lisa Albrecht. So she visited the East in 1948 and she was shocked at the sight of Rubble Women. And I think that's sort of encapsulates the divide, because obviously in the West, where it was a lot more conservative, women were meant to be stay-at-home wives. And so this image of, liberated woman doing jobs that men do,
can seen as very unwomanly to work at all, let alone to do that kind of physical.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So in West Germany, I think the Rubble Women in West Germany were remembered as part of a sort of broader narrative of recovery and the economic miracle, I suppose. I mean, you could argue they were integral in the economic miracle, because obviously in order to bring that about, first of all, they had to clear everything up and make it so that they could have this miracle in the 50s in the West. But I think, to be honest, they were, the difference is that you had, in the East, it became a way of, again, just promoting socialism, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, in the East, they were seen as the trailblazers of women working. So the trailblazers of achieving gender equality, a trailblazer of a core element of socialism. The West, I found this really fascinating article, and then I went right down the rabbit hole of the use of Rubble Women in West Germany, and it's fascinating. In the early 50s, there was a bit of commemoration, right? We saw memorials erected all over West Germany. Like there's one in the Hassenheide Park of Berlin that was erected in 55. And then some women in the early 50s, and men, so women and men, were awarded medals, the Order of Merit for their contribution cleaning rubble. But then after that, it basically drops out of public image because, like we discussed, it doesn't fit with West Germany's perspective on women. Right? Women in West Germany were meant to be Kinder, Küche und Kirche. So children, kitchen, and church. That was the role for women. Up until 1955, it was enshrined in the West German Constitution that a woman had to have her husband's permission to work. And a clause of that remained until 1977. So this idea of working women did not fit with the West German narrative, which was incredibly conservative from my current perspective. If we look at
I think
women's
it's
rights,
objectively pretty conservative.
Objectively conservative. I think I can say that. There was, however, there's this concept of the Rubble Women as being a part of this phoenix rising from the ashes, the West German economic miracle. They liked the story as much as it was a part of that backstory for West Germany, this resilience, the determination of West Germany. But it was kind of more harnessed as a nationwide story. It kind of lost that female, exactly,
to deal with the guilt,
and also to help paint. Oh, Germans were victims too. I actually read that there was some alarming use of the Rubble Women image by continuing fascists. It allowed them to paint, to focus on the victimhood of Germans.
Right.
And then there was this really fascinating rediscovery of the Rubble Women in the West in the 80s for two major reasons. One is feminism, right? The feminist movement's coming up. Women are getting committed to look at women's history and find out what hasn't been talked about. And something I didn't expect to have put it back on the table, a reform to the pension by Koh's government. So basically in the 80s, Koh suggests this new pension concept, which will mean that a mother's first year of looking at, like the first year of a baby's life will be counted toward the mother's pension. But there was going to be a clause in it which excluded women born before 1921. And that's when in West Germany, there's this massive kind of rediscovery or redigging out of the rubble, shall we say, of the image of the Rubble Women. So the women born before 1921 could say, hey, look what we've done for this nation. Look at our contribution.
Right.
And so that's when there's this kind of rediscovery of the Rubble Women as a female story in West Germany.
Yeah, and that's when they start to get all of these memorials, right?
I think actually a lot of the memorials were from the 50s.
Oh, really?
I
Okay.
thought so. I thought there's this brief kind of period of memory in the 50s, this we are rising from the ashes, look at our determination, and also this focusing on victimhood of the West Germany. And then there's kind of like, it doesn't fit with our image of women. Shh.
Yeah.
And I did also read that it was only really for those kind of 30 years discussed in West Germany in the context of pitying East Germany, which fits interestingly with that account you found of a West German politician visiting the Soviet zone. This, we've had the economic miracle so our women can be where they belong in the kitchen with the children at the church. But, East Germany, their economy's failing so terribly. Women still have to clear rubble.
Yeah.
It was only really discussed to demonize the economy of East Germany.
Yeah.
And then there's this rediscovery of the image in the 80s because it comes useful for this pension right for older women.
Okay, so yeah, there's just a lull, basically. A lull in the memory. So, and as we said, there are memorials to the Rubble Women all over Germany. So the commemoration there was a new, yes, as you said, wave of this kind of commemoration of the Rubble Women, which was actually initiated after a former Rubble Woman actually hanged herself in 1986 due to financial struggles.
Oh, I don't know that.
So, and that's linked to the 9th of July, which is a day of remembrance for the women who cleared rubble. Something interesting, another interesting fact is actually the famous Karl Marx Allee in East Berlin, originally called Stalin Allee, actually had flats specifically given to Trümmerfrauen. So women who worked in East Berlin clearing rubble were actually given flats in these very nice apartment blocks, Stalinist apartment blocks, which did eventually become flats for the kind of elite, the Communist Party elite. But yeah, they, at least at first, the Rubble Women did have some, priority, which is quite nice to know. Now, there is actually a book that was written by a historian called Leonie Treber, and it's actually titled The Myth of the Rubble Women. And I guess, to be honest, the Rubble Women weren't, it's not that they didn't exist. They did exist. There is literally photographic evidence of them. They did exist. It's just more, I guess the nuances. It's talking about the nuances, I suppose you could say, and to the extent to which the memory of and the way they are remembered has been kind of inflated. Yeah. So, for example, in Berlin, 60,000 women were mobilized for clearing rubble, which was about 5% of the female population. Now, people viewed clearing, like I alluded to earlier, people viewed clearing rubble as a punishment. Because during the war, like I said, it had been the prisoners of war, forced laborers, concentration camp inmates who'd been forced to clear the rubble after Allied air raids on German cities. But obviously, after the end of the war, that all changed, and Nazi Party members and workers.
It was a punishment, literally.
Yeah.
So people found by the occupation armies who thought, you've got quite the Nazi past, or sometimes you were a Nazi Party member. They're forced originally, before they kind of coordinate, hey, all people between this age and that age are unemployed, have to do this work, or people can volunteer. Before there's that kind of coordinated effort, it's literally a punishment labor of Nazis.
Yeah. Exactly. And like we said, it was usually voluntary in the West, but they were actually forced to in the Soviet zone. And Treber says that the image of the cheerful Rubble woman going to work to help to rebuild the country is ingrained in the collective memory in Germany. And as we have already said, it's, I think, partly to kind of help with the shame and the guilt of what they did, of what the Nazis did. And because, and also, as Miss Ernestina said, the myth portrays them as the sole saviors of the devastated cities.
That they, kind of the narrative is very much, they cleared the whole thing, right? All of Germany was cleared by rubble. That's very much the narrative. And really, before this book by Leonie Treber came out, I think, had you have, let's say, Googled Rubble Women, you'd have just found these incredible stories. You'd have found, women talking about working with their hands and clearing live ammunition. And this woman who said it took us 7 months to clear just one building to the point where it could be reconstructed. And this kind of heroic painting. And I found in German also only, unfortunately, on YouTube, Trümmerfrau erzählen or Rubble Women explain. And quotes like, wir haben es gern gemacht, like we did it with pleasure, saying because, with all the work, we could see our cities improving and improving. This very altruistic, selfless painting, and also certainly the message, these women did it all. And I think Treber's book, her thesis is that actually statistically, if you look at the clearing of rubble across Germany, their contribution was small. The majority of it was cleared by machinery and men. So their contribution in terms of actual clearing has been inflated beyond reality. Her other point is that this idea that they were selflessly doing with pleasure what had to be done, she's saying actually it was mostly seen by people as a shameful punishment work. And she revealed that a lot of the most famous photos we have of these women working together were actually staged to try and get more people to sign up for the labor. Because there was such a negative connotation with rubble clearing, because like you said, it was performed by people the Nazis called, undesirables or degenerates throughout the war, then performed as a punishment after the war, and it's hard work. A lot of people didn't want to sign up. And so there was actually the staging by the Soviet occupation force of these well-dressed, made-up women sorting rubble, right? A lot of the images that when I imagine a rubble woman, I discovered that most of the images that I have in my mind were staged. And so that's really what Leonie Treber is getting at, that we've kind of inflated this thing out of reality. But normally I'm a very pro, it's super important to remember history as it was and to be very careful we don't twist it too much to any purpose. But I kind of feel like women are so underrepresented normally in history that maybe a little bit of inflation in the interest of women being remembered isn't so bad.
Well, and that's why I want to start this series about women in history. But I do think, no. And I think that it was inflated, definitely, but that doesn't negate
exactly
from the contribution that these women did give.
That's exactly it. Yeah, it doesn't negate that individual women really did this. And also I think probably when historians look at how many were actually registered to clear rubble, that of course, I doubt that speaks to those individual women who literally cleared out their house and helped their neighbor clear out his house and cleared the path to the nearest water pump. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So you have all of these sort of smaller contributions, which are probably not registered. And you probably also even have rubble women who weren't registered as well. So, and it was also, I think, used, the idea of the rubble woman was used to foster a sense of unity and sort of national identity during the Cold War. And that's obviously when you had this kind of complex interplay between the different images in both Germanys come about. But yeah, super interesting.
I do have one more thing to add. I actually found an account of a journalist who went to gymnastics with some surviving rubble women. And just after newspaper reports started to hit about the myth of the Rubble Woman book. And a now very, very old lady who had herself been a rubble woman as a teenager in Berlin. She actually said it was dangerous work and that historian has no clue. And so I think exactly like you were saying, Artie, just because the image of the level of these women's contribution to the nationwide clearing was inflated, and just because their image was harnessed in various political ways doesn't negate the contribution of the individual women and what they actually achieved at that time. Yeah,
exactly. And that's something that you've always got to remember, and because, they had been through so much, and, I've said multiple times already, but it's just such a testament to the unbreakable resolve of the human spirit, So yeah, the story of the Rubble Women it's inspiring, but it's also complex. like I've said already multiple times, it just reflects the resilience of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, you know?
Yeah, and also the incredible moments in history where women have stood into roles that at the time were considered not for them.
Yes, exactly.
And they were often really considered not capable of fulfilling these roles. And here we're seeing a time where women absolutely proved that they were capable of doing labor, of making decisions, of supporting survival of themselves and other human beings, which at the time was very much outside of the gender roles that were kind of available to them or limiting what people thought of their capabilities.
Yes, definitely. I think that's really important to understand as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of everything. That was super interesting, Miss Ernestina. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
Yeah, and we will be back with more episodes of Women in History. I haven't thought about the name of that series yet, but I will think of it before I release this episode. And yeah, I think I would also quite like to go and make videos of places named after women here in Berlin. So that'll be a fun little project for us to do. So got lots of interesting content about women in history coming up for you guys. So, and I can't think of a better person to do it with than you, Miss Ernestina. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Artie. Pleasure to be here.
Lovely to have you. And yeah, thanks for listening, guys. And yeah, see you next time. Bye.
Bye.